Right.
All right, 7 people. No, we get it'll pick up hopefully over the half hour, hour, whatever we're doing here. But hi everybody, it's Eric. Obviously, I'm joined by my good friend from grad school, Elizabeth Urban, who was kind enough to jump on here and help me out. Danny's got some family stuff going on with the wonderful 250 celebration. As you know, we at American Prestige are all thrilled to be participating in the American 250 celebration. But no, he's got some family stuff going on. So Elizabeth is here. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, Derek. Thanks so much for having me today.
It's great to have you. It's great to see you. We haven't talked in a while.
I
Elizabeth
know.
Elizabeth is she was one of my good friends from grad school. She actually stayed and got the PhD. Didn't leave in the middle like I did. So she's got a degree in Islamic history. She's focused on early Islam. In particular, she's writing a Substack newsletter, Islamic History for the curious. You've got a book that if I try to do the title off the top of my head, I will mangle it. But we actually did an interview about Elizabeth's book on foreign exchanges podcast a while ago. If anybody wants to listen to that, it's at my newsletter. So yeah, there's all kinds of stuff to talk about here, I guess.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to talk about the Substack or just to reminisce about our days back at the
Oh God, no,
library.
nobody wants to hear. Yeah, nobody wants to hear about the days in the library. But that would be nice. We could just reminisce about grad school. Make everybody listen to that. Yeah, so let's talk about your Substack. What are you? How did it come about? Like, I know we've gone through the sordid story of academia and post academia and all of that. You don't have to go into that for everybody, but you started to do a newsletter. It was initially, I think, a little more kind of eclectic, but really started focusing on Islamic history. What led you to that?
Yeah. So yes, when I first started the Substack, it was called Harpy and the Shrew, which is an old inside joke with one of my friends, and it was more eclectic. It was kind of like, hey, I'm trying to make it as a writer. I'm going to try to get some nonfiction, writing out there about history, about academia, things like this. And then as I kept trying to think of things to write every week, I just kept coming back to my true love, Islamic history. I spent 15 years as a professor of Islamic history at Westchester University, which is near Philadelphia. I've recently left that position, but it's not for lack of love of the study of history, the study of that tradition, and a real passion for teaching about that tradition. And so I wanted to have a form of writing that was not the academic monograph that only 5 people are going to read, but also wasn't just the soundbite on social media. I wanted some middle ground where I could really help people understand what is this tradition of Islam, how to think historically about religious traditions, and maybe be a little bit sassy, a little bit irreverent, or let some of my sense of humor come out while writing too, which they frown on if you do that in an academic
Yeah, they don't
monograph.
like that in academia. I mean, this is sort of like when I left, and uh, I left grad school partly because I had decided it wasn't where I wanted to be, and partly because my wife got a really good job opportunity outside of Chicago. So we decided to take that. I had made her suffer for me being in grad school long enough, but we got here, and I was like applying for jobs, and I thought I'll just start doing like a little blogging or something to pass the time while I'm doing this. And it was the same thing. Like I kept trying to write about other stuff, but the only thing I had in my head at that point was like all the stuff that I'd learned in grad school. So I just started writing that, and that's like buried on something on an old blog way, in the past. But yeah, it was similar. Like it was just like, what am I going to write about? So I started doing that. But yeah, so you're writing. I mean, I think it's great because you're doing these like really bite sized, taking a small topic and trying to explain it for people who are not familiar. And I get the sense that some of it comes out of your experience talking to people about what it is that you have been doing for a living and saying, "Well, I got to, I studied Islamic history," and their eyes like bugging out of their heads, basically, or like the questions start coming. So, what are some of the things that some of the reactions that you've gotten over the years when you've told people that?
Over the years, the number one reaction I've gotten is this kind of, I'm from the South, I'm from Texas. So this kind of skeptical, oh, huh, well, isn't that nice?
Like,
Well, bless
oh,
your
bless your
heart.
heart. That's so nice. Yeah. Hmm.
Which means, for those of you who don't speak Southern, I
Yeah.
think that's totally weird, but it's rude to say that to your face. So I'm going to say, bless your heart. Or people kind of saying, not to my face, but to like I was getting into Islamic studies in college. My best friend's mom would come visit and she'd kind of go to my best friend, now, why is she doing that? Now, why is she studying that? Um, so just some confusion, just some like why would you do that? And whereas of course I'm coming from it from this position of curiosity and this kind of voracious desire to understand how religion works and um how does faith motivate people and how do people interpret these religious texts that come down and how do they derive meaning from them and how do they use them in their everyday lives. And I was just so curious about this, not just Islam. I was a religion major, so I was curious about Judaism and Buddhism and to be quite frank with you, everything except for Christianity, which is the tradition that I grew up in. And so I didn't have as much of a curiosity at the time for that. Um, but so I was just voraciously curious about it, and if people thought it was weird to be curious, which is I don't understand that. But then, as I write in one of my Substacks, the kind of first one that was like, "How did I get into Islamic studies?"
Right.
I just mentioned that, people, for as long as I've been around, and this is before 9/11, people would kind of talk smack about Islam without seeming to know anything about it. And so I was already interested in Islam. And then during college, 9/11 happened. And I thought, maybe perhaps naively, I thought, I can become an emissary for knowledge and peace, love, and understanding if I teach people about this misunderstood tradition.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it's a noble idea. Yeah,
eh, maybe. It
But
may also
I
be a,
do like think if you had, decided to study Buddhism, you probably wouldn't have gotten the same same kind of questions or the like, people talking to your roommate's mother, kind of whispering about you behind your back.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Um, so thinking about like the interactions that you've had or the genesis of the series that you're doing, the newsletter that you're doing, like a lot of it is tackling misconceptions, right? People's
Yep.
misconceptions about Islam. What are like the top two or three misconceptions that you find about the religion? I mean, I'm not trying to, I really don't want to talk about like contemporary politics because I'm supposed to be taking a break this week from that. So for my mental health, but I mean, yeah, that too. I'm sure that's part of it too. But about the religion or its formation in particular, like what are some of the things that you encounter that you're trying to kind of correct the record?
Yeah, for sure. I'll tell you some of those things, and I'll just preface it by saying a lot of the Substack, but then a lot, also a lot of what I'm going to say comes from a 15-year career teaching undergraduates, coming into my classes saying things like, I had no idea that Muslims worshiped God, which is like the number one tenet of Islam is that they worship God. They conceive it of God as being the same God as Jews and Christians. We can get into theological debates about that, but that's what Muslims believe. And just having students say, "Well, I thought they worshipped a different God, Allah." And I'm like, "Yeah, Allah means God in Arabic.
Right.
Like Arabic speaking Christians worship Allah." And so that's strangely enough, the number one misconception I see is, wow, Muslims worship God. I didn't know that. It's like number
That's
one tenet. Um,
right there.
but the
Yeah.
other one that I hear a
Do you
lot,
ever get anybody who comes who has read the? I don't know if you remember the Chick tracks. The like Muslims worship the moon god or whatever. That was my
oh,
favorite
yeah,
one. Like somebody,
that,
I can't remember who turned me onto those things in grad school, but they're so incredible. and that was the one
That's
that like really got me.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that stuff may still be happening, but I luckily at this point am isolated or insulated from it and also have snappy comebacks to it. But I think that's the kind of thing that students maybe used to say more like 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah,
Now it's not even they have misinformation about like that's almost a too sophisticated level of misinformation that they have to be like, well, someone said that, God originally comes from the pre-Islamic god Hubal, who's the moon god. I'm like, that's wow, your misinformation is already at least somewhat learned. Whereas
you're
like now,
misinformed at a 12th grade level. Congratulations.
that's right, that's right. Whereas no, now I don't get as many kind of maybe when I say conspiracy theories or something like this. I do get very persistently, and something that made me at times frustrated and even depressed is not the right word, intellectually depressed, is the persistent misinformation about women in Islam. I had a student who came to one of my classes on women in Islamic history, um, who came from a Catholic school background, and she's told me that her teachers literally told her that Islam invented patriarchy. And I'm just like, Islam was born in the year 620 or so.
Yeah,
Hammurabi's code, which advocates throwing women into the river if they're accused of even suspected of, adultery, that's from like 2500 BC. So if we're going to make accusations about who's inventing patriarchy, which is I think a silly thing to argue about in the first place, let's not put it in the 7th century. All
yeah,
right? So just to hear, if this was in like 2023 to say, my teacher said Islam invented patriarchy. Like
sure.
that's
Yeah, there's no
that's a
patriarchy in
claim.
Christianity or
That's
anything like that.
yeah, yeah, that's
Um,
a claim.
well, I mean, it's like Israel and Iran have been at war for 5,000 years, and that type of thing. Like, it's funny. Yeah, people don't seem to understand how new, and that sounds weird to say because it's not really new anymore, but how new Islam is relative uh, to even the other Abrahamic faiths, let alone like ancient Mesopotamia or anything like that.
Oh, for sure. Well, I think it's funny that, when you and I were both at the University of Chicago together, you and I were considered modernists.
Yes.
I I focus on the 8th century. And,
Yeah.
and I'm a modernist because the ancients were like ancient Egypt, ancient Assyria, ancient
Right.
whatever. So for me,
Right.
yeah, Islam is modern.
Yeah. I mean, I was a little later than you were. I was 16th century, I guess. So that is sort of
Right, right, right.
pre-modern, I suppose. But
It's
yeah,
pre-modern, but
um, still a long
mm,
time ago. Like, still a long time
it
ago.
depends on how you look at it.
I guess. Yeah, I guess. Good point. Um, I do want to say, like, if anybody has questions for Elizabeth about Islam, Islamic history, Arabic, she's teaching Arabic. She's taught Arabic, is teaching Arabic, or will be teaching Arabic again. So anybody has questions like that, please drop them in the comments, and we'll try to get to them. Um, but yeah, so like, have you had? How much have you gotten a response to some of the things that you've been writing? Like, has anything really caught on in terms of like people being like, "Wow, I didn't know that," or "This is really enlightening to me."
Yeah, in terms of the Substack for sure. And I see a
Yeah.
couple people saying Assalamu alaikum. I'll say alaikum assalam to
Alaikum
you in
salam
the
wa
chat.
rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Oh, yeah. Wow, very pious of you, Derek. Yeah, I'd say a couple of the ones that have gotten the most kind of, I don't know, reposts or comments or like wow or likes or whatever, if I don't those metrics are useful, is the one on where is the Middle East? Because it's not as firm of a term as people might like to think it is, and to look at who invented that term and under what context. And isn't it interesting how that term seems to shift to encompass whatever area is having a conflict in that
It,
general region? They'll go,
it's a liminal space, Elizabeth. It's
it's a,
wherever the
it's a,
problem is. Yeah.
It's wherever the problem is, right? And so then people go, well, why is the Middle East always so full of conflict? It's like because that's how it's defined. It's defined by the liminal space where there is conflict. Old colonial histories of conflict. So it's kind of in the definition. So that's one that I've gotten some interesting feedback on, or some like positive feedback on. The one that I think you helped me out by restacking was, I think, the one on how to remember the difference between
Well,
Sunnis and
I
Shia.
commented on the one about the Middle East because I have a very clear definition of the Middle East, which is the Nile River to the Oxus River, as we learned in grad school. I don't think there's any
As
ambiguity about this.
there's there's no ambiguity. I think I responded, all right, Marshall Hodgson, who's like the old school historian, Chicago guy who wrote the 3 volume, you
He's the
know,
father of,
died while
yeah, he's
writing
the
the
father
third
of the
volume of
program
his
in
book.
Chicago.
That's right. Which, yeah, if people could accept it as a purely geographical term, that would be wonderful. But they imbue it with all these other um, ideas too. But the how to remember the difference between Sunnis and Shia, which if you're anything like my students, people can learn some facts about Sunnis and Shia all semester, and then when you ask them to remember on the exam or whatever, they don't remember. And so a lot of my teaching about Sunnis and Shia was having my students come up with these mnemonic devices for how can we remember what's the difference, because they also sound so similar in English too, right? Sunni, Shia, I mean, they both start with S, they're both a little amorphous. So just the idea of like the Shia are slightly more like the Catholics, and the Catholics have a pope, a papa, and the Shia have the imam, the mama, the kind of divinely inspired leader. Like those are things that my students would come up with to try to remember the difference. So it's not part of the Substack's point is not just to give people factoids that they could get anywhere, but to
Right,
use some
right,
pedagogy, to use some, hey, are you aware of this analogy from, let's say, the Constitution? Hey, that same analogy can be applied to Islamic law. Trying to get people to make these connections and um, to kind of help them orient themselves, so it's not just factoid, factoid, factoid.
right,
I think those are
right.
the two that have kind of been the most.
Okay,
Oh,
okay.
and then the one on Sharia, because Sharia is the one that,
That's the one that everybody panics about. Yeah, like
yeah,
Sharia
people
law is coming to
still.
Texas, Elizabeth. I don't know if you knew this, but
Oh, well, yes. I mean, this is what we're all afraid of, isn't it? Which I didn't even know about this. It's a perennial thing, right? It comes up every couple of
yeah,
years, but I didn't even know about the recent one in uh, in Texas until my parents, who still live
yeah.
in
Oh,
Amarillo, Texas,
there you go.
told me. And I was just like, oh, and I saw something about, Zohran Mamdani, people saying like, oh, he's trying to sneak Sharia law in. I'm like, A, he's not, and B, you don't even know what that word means.
Yeah,
To you, it just means this is scary, and it means cutting off hands and stoning people to death, and you don't actually know what it means. So let's
let's talk
learn
about
a
it.
little
Yeah.
bit. Let's talk about it.
So we got a good question I think we can dig into here, which is the emergence of the Harajites from Joshua A. Locke 9431. The social political basis of the emergence of the Harajites, which gets you into all sorts of fun things about the Sunni and Shia and the First Civil War. So, Elizabeth, why don't you talk about how the Harajites emerged?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Kharijites are kind of sometimes treated as the third sect of Islam. You have the Sunnis, who are the majority sect, the Shia, who are a minority sect, and then the Kharijites, who are like, I'd have to look at the numbers, but they're like
Very small, yeah, very small.
0.3% of all Muslims today or something. So technically a third sect, but not very highly practiced today. There are some Kharijite communities in Oman today that I think are the main ones. So yeah, the Kharijites emerged in very early Islamic history, as you mentioned, in this
They've toned
context of
down. I mean, the
what's
Ibadiyya is sort of they're not what they used to be. Let's say.
right. Right. So they began as essentially the most radical sect of Muslims, hardline, um, both in terms of politics and in terms of theology. So, in terms of the politics, there was this first civil war, which you mentioned before, which is essentially when Prophet Muhammad died. there's a disagreement about who did he nominate a successor, did he not nominate a successor. There's a tenuous, tense period where there are three caliphs, leaders, that is to say, successors of the Prophet Muhammad,
Right.
who rule. But the Shia, the entire time during the reigns of these three other caliphs, the Shia are going, it should have been Ali the whole time. It should have been Ali. It should have been Ali. Finally, after the murder, I was going to say death, but it was really the murder of the third caliph, Ali finally rises to power. This, however, is coterminous with the first civil war in Islamic
Right.
history, because Ali, not himself, but his party, his group, his Shia. Shia literally means the party of Ali. His followers were accused of having been the ones who murdered the third caliph. So it's
Right.
like the fourth caliph is essentially accused of having murdered the third caliph, and so then people choose sides. Here's the fourth caliph. Here's the third caliph. Who's going to win? Or the third caliph's cousins and cronies.
Right. And
During this
I mean,
period,
he's at least accused of not going after the murderers of the third
of
caliph.
not
If not, if
prosecuting the
not
murder, of knowing
prosecuting.
who the murderer
Right.
is and
And
not
like,
prosecuting the murderer, and kind of,
yeah.
so then it's like, revenge for the fallen caliph Uthman. And so it's this kind of the party of Uthman, the fallen caliph, and the party of Ali. So the party of Ali, which we can call the Shia Ali, they are in some sense considered the more pious, righteous group, whereas Uthman was known for kind of being a little bit worldly, a little bit wealthy, a little bit giving, cushy
Nepotistic.
positions to
Yeah.
his cousins.
Right.
And whereas Ali is kind of like, no, it should be the most pious, the most, God fearing should be in power. So it's this is oversimplifying a little bit, but it's like the more worldly secular rulers and the more pious, perhaps idealistic rulers. So these two sides are fighting, and the kind of person who takes up the flag of Uthman is a guy called Muawiyah, which, by the way, in Arabic, Muawiyah means howling bitch, which is like a wonderful pre-Islamic name, right? After people start getting more like Islamic names, you don't find people called Muawiyah
No,
anymore,
yeah, a lot
howling
of the
bitch.
fun names go away, yeah, for sure.
The fun names go away. But so Muawiyah and Ali are fighting on the battlefield. They are locked neck and neck, and Muawiyah's people essentially hold up Qurans
Right.
on their spears, and they say we should stop. We should let God decide this. We shouldn't decide this on the battlefield. We should let God decide this. We should have arbitration. We should talk this out. Ali agrees. This is when the Kharijites said, "Oh no, you were supposed to let God decide that on the
On the
battlefield.
battlefield. Right.
The fact that you agreed to discussions, arbitration with these worldly, secular, you know, uh, guys means that you are a grave sinner and a apostate, and you don't believe in the Quran, you don't believe in God. I mean, this idea that you have betrayed us, and so they kill him. So the tagline, the phrase, the motto of the Kharijites in Arabic is "La hukma illa billah." Illa lillah. There's no judgment except God's. God will decide everything. So you should have fought it out on the battlefield.
Right.
If you weren't meant to be caliph, you should have died. And if
Right.
you were meant to be caliph, you would have won that battle. So
And
they
I
kill him, and then they become this like very hard line. If you're not with us, you're against us. If
sort
you're
of
not with us, you're
schismatic,
an
yeah.
unbeliever. Very schismatic,
Right.
very
The
like
caliph should always be the most pious person, which of
the
course
caliph
it's
should
not a
always.
stable basis really for deciding a leader, as it turns out. Yeah.
Right, right, right. I think one way of thinking about it is that both the Sunnis and the Shia would eventually kind of come up with a way of, this is fancy academic speak, but for trying to routinize the charisma of Islam.
Right.
That is to say, Muhammad was this charismatic prophet who brought a new religion, but at some point you have to make a system out of that. You have to set down the rule of law. You have to decide who's going to be in charge and stuff. Whereas the Kharijites seem like they kind of wanted to keep that revolutionary, charismatic energy going all the time, which can be really appealing if you're into the like, let's rise up, let's rebel, very idealistic. It's not very practical if you're actually going to try
Doesn't
to
Yeah, it doesn't work
make a
out so
stable
well.
state.
Although I
Yeah.
mean, to be fair, like Ali was kind of a sucker for going to arbitration, right? I mean, he goes to arbitration, and like Muawiyah's, they each appoint an arbitrator, and Muawiyah's arbitrator rules that Muawiyah should be caliph, and Ali's arbitrator rules like, well, I don't know, you both have a good case, like, and he's just like duped into this no-win situation. He winds up ignoring the arbitration that he agreed to, that wound up causing the schism in the first place, and things just go downhill
Right,
from
right,
there. So.
right. Yeah, some people argue, I mean, this is all getting into historical argument and stuff, but that Ali was this very pious guy who was truly trying to do the right thing, but wasn't being very savvy about it.
Yeah.
So when he, nominated Abu Musa al-Ash'ari to be his arbitrator, Abu Musa is this like thoughtful. I think that's who it was. That might be. I'll have to look that up. But a more gentle, kind of thoughtful, let's talk this out kind of arbitrator. Muawiyah, I know more about the Umayyads. They're my guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
Muawiyah nominated Amr ibn al-As, who is like,
I
he's
mean, he's a
known as
general.
one
He's the
of,
guy who conquered Egypt. So I mean, like, he's
he's
not.
a
Yeah.
general, he's a clever guy. He's known as one of the, I don't know how the right way to translate this, but like one of the sneaky, wily guys of Islam as Amr ibn al-As. So it's almost in a way like, by trying to be so noble and pious, this is one way of looking at it. Ali ended up getting himself tripped by the wily guys, the tricksy guys.
In many such cases, I guess,
Yeah.
the thoughtful guys always get rolled. There's another good question. I think you may have some real insight about, is the connection between the Jewish communities in pre-Islamic Arabia and the emergence of Muhammad and Islam in Mecca. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So this is one of the really challenging things to talk about when it comes to early Islamic history for a couple reasons. One, there's basically two divergent narratives that people have about the relationship between Judaism and Islam and early Islam and this kind of area time in
Well, I mean, the relationship
post
sours
temple Judaism.
quickly, yeah. But I
It
think
does,
in
but
the lead up to like the milieu that Muhammad emerges into, there's some interesting
right, right,
connections.
right. And so this is where I think the narrative sometimes diverges, because sometimes people want to talk about this as though Islam is kind of a borrowing of Judaism, or Islam like was kind of trying to be Jewish but kind of got it wrong, and once they realized they got it wrong, they kind of became a new religion. And historians don't like to view it in this way of like they they poorly imitated something else. Instead, we like to see the resonances between Judaism and Islam, and aware that Judaism and Christianity were both well known and well established in Arabia before the rise of Islam. And so we can kind of take as granted that probably Muhammad was aware of both of these traditions, was aware of some of the ritual laws of Judaism and Christianity. But I think one of the challenges too is that it's so hard when you're looking at the origins of a religion, or a medieval kind of vestige of a religion, or a medieval version of a religion, to not assume that it was just like what the modern version is. So when
Right.
Jews think about medieval Judaism, they think about Judaism today. When Christians think about medieval Christianity, they think about Christianity today. And one of the challenges is that in the 6th and 7th century, there was more of a kind of, the boundaries weren't so clear between Judaism and Christianity in the first place. and then between what we might call Judeo-Christianity and Islam. So it was more of a. There's a famous book that talks about the milieu of early Islam, of being kind of like all of these religious ideas are in flux and in motion and are in the air, but they don't yet have the hard and fast boundaries that we think of as now. So it's clear to me that Islam and Judaism have a lot of things in common. In addition to the fact that the Quran mentions Moses and mentions the story of Joseph and all this stuff. Um, Also, for example, just the dietary restrictions, right? Kosher dietary restrictions are fairly similar to Islamic dietary restrictions. Um, Prayer, the early first Muslim prayer was towards Jerusalem and not towards Mecca. And it was only after the Jews and Muslims kind of had a falling out that Muhammad turned towards Mecca,
Right. And
um, at least
we
according to the
know this because there
traditions.
are surviving mosques that have two different directions of prayer that are evidence of the shift, just to be clear.
Right. We have good evidence that this shift happened. Um, and so, this is where I love studying early Islam because but it's also really fraught to study early
Yeah.
Islam, especially when you're talking to believing Muslims for whom early Islam doesn't look exactly like Islam today. And that's not to say that somehow Islam today is wrong or bad or something. It's just, as I'm a historian, things
Yeah.
change to fit their historical circumstances. So
Right.
I'm really interested in the ways that this early community, which I view as a monotheistic community that was seeking a monotheistic way of life, but that knew of Judaism and that knew of Christianity and was kind of trying to figure out what is the right way to worship God, um,
My dog is
drawing, but
howling
then
in the
also doing
background. I'm
creative
sorry. There's
things.
nothing I can do about it. It's not because of
Okay,
this.
you
It's not
poor
because of
dog.
anything we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I feel like I'm getting a little wordy, and it's just because I'm trying to be careful not to say like,
No,
"Oh,
I
and
mean, but
Islam took
it is a
that
fraught
from
subject,
Judaism."
right? I mean, it's very fraught to talk about early Islam as something that developed over time and not something that emerged
Right.
whole cloth the way we know it today. On the one hand, it's obvious. I mean, there are things about Islam today that we know didn't develop until later on. The schools of jurisprudence, for example, or any number of other things. But it's still hard to kind of bridge that for both. I think believing practicing Muslims who want to, approach this as something that is eternal, and for people
Right.
who want to criticize Islam and just treat it as, having been all one thing throughout history with no nuance. You get pushback in both cases.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes it's a real challenge for teachings for something like what are the basics you need to know about Islam? Well, if we're talking about what you need to know about what people believe today, that's a different question than I think people in the Islam 101 classes often start with kind of a historical, here's who Muhammad was, here's what the Quran was. And the problem is that from a historical perspective, those things are very fraught. And in some ways, it's easier to just say, let's talk about what Muslims believe and what Muslims
Right.
practice. Because when you get into the kind of academic critical history of it, you get into this soup of non-denominational monotheism where we have early documents where Muhammad and the Jews of Medina are making compacts together to say, like, we are one community. And, what does that mean exactly? And did Muslims view themselves as Jews? Doesn't seem so, because the Quran mentions Jews and Christians as separate groups, but it's very fraught and very complicated. But I do like to see the similarities. And in fact, I will say rabbinic Judaism, so the Judaism that kind of really started to gain ground, maybe we can say in this period of like 8th, ninth, 10th century, a lot of that is based on earlier texts, but a lot of that development happened during the Islamic period and in dialogue with Islamic law. So you can see, for example, with things like menstruation laws, the ways that Islamic law and Jewish law are kind of like bouncing back and forth about
Right.
what's the right way to do this. So we see the
Right.
conversations happening in these legal traditions.
So we got a couple of other questions I think would be interesting to tackle here. One is the historicity of Muhammad, which is always an interesting question, and we could talk about that. I think because it is kind of. I mean, the biographies of Muhammad don't emerge until the 800s. I think. Really, I mean, there's earlier texts that are probably contained within them, but that don't survive. So you're really relying a lot on the Quran to establish Muhammad, and the few references to Muhammad that you get from non-Islamic texts or non-Islamic sources around the time when Arabs were coming out of Arabia and defeating the Byzantines and defeating the Persians, and there's some mention of Muhammad, and that's really close to his lifetime. I mean, like it does seem like it's indirect. It's not it's secondhand. It's difficult to draw too much from that. But those conquests happened. Within the same generation, they started to happen at least within the generation of people who were his followers. So it's not that far removed. It's not a terrible source. The Quran, I would imagine, is really the big one, and the fact that we have now. This used to be a question, like when did the Quran emerge, and how did it emerge? Did it emerge over like centuries after Muhammad supposedly lived, or did it, when did we have something that was recognizably? But we now have copies of the Quran that are really early, like very very early. So I would imagine that's one big one. But maybe you can talk about how we kind of get around a historical Muhammad.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are several great books and a few articles I can even point people to on the question of the historical Muhammad. Um, and as you said, Derek, we have, uh, I'd have to look up the exact number, but something like 93% complete early Islamic manuscripts from the late 7th century. So we are pretty, I mean, as historical evidence goes, that's pretty good. Mentions Muhammad. Um, it doesn't tell us a lot about Muhammad in the Quran, but does mention him by name, and it says, it clearly positions him as the prophet and the leader of this community. And yes, we do have some almost contemporary non-Arabic accounts about the kind of not usually called Muslims, usually called something
No,
else.
usually, I mean, a Christian heretical sect or a Jewish heretical sect, like yeah, it's usually how they get
That's
into it.
right. This
Like we don't really know
this
who these
weird
people
sect.
are, but yeah, they say they say they're this or whatever. Yeah,
Right. These Saracens or these Hagarenes or whatever are
right,
coming, well, they're
right,
led by this guy called Muhammad, and or we're trying to deal with this crisis. So I think we can be on fairly certain ground that Muhammad was a historical person, that he was the leader of some kind of religious movement in Arabia, and that then kind of spurred these conquests. The challenge is trying to know much more about him.
right.
The kind of human things that people want to know. What was he like? And, what were his marriages like? And how many kids did he have? We have all of this narrative from the Islamic tradition, but those sources are fairly late, as you say. They're not written down until the 8th and 9th century. And so scholars, some especially very skeptical scholars, have said, well, we can't use those, and then they kind of have compared it to the study of trying to unearth the kind of historical Jesus of when we have Jesus, we have the Gospels, which like we don't have anything that's really contemporary to Jesus, but we have the Gospels, which purport to talk about Jesus's preaching. Then we have Paul's epistles, and Paul comes in and gives his kind of interpretation of who Jesus was. And then about the same time, we have this Jewish writer, Josephus, who's writing a third kind of account. So with Jesus, we don't know a lot about Jesus, but we have these three almost contemporary kind of extrapolations of different angles on Jesus. Whereas Muhammad, we have the Quran, and then we have silence until like
Right.
the mid 9th century, and then suddenly we have 20
Yeah, and,
full-length biographies of Muhammad. And so
and
they
there,
go,
I
what
mean,
happened in the middle?
there are
In the middle there.
possible explanations for that, right? Because you have a whole dynasty that comes and goes in the interim, the Umayyads, and
For
whose
sure.
writings may have been expunged, or they just didn't survive the takeover by the Abbasids. But
That's right.
you're just guessing
I'm
at
just
that point.
plugging
Yeah,
in, by the way.
you're you're just
Yeah, at
you're
that
just
point,
like
and then
trying to answer from ignorance. Like, why don't we have any earlier sources? Well, this is one possible reason, I guess.
right, right, right. And one area of scholarship that is not my main area of scholarship is the study of orality and oral cultures, because one of the challenges too is that it's not just that these Umayyad narratives were expunged, so that's part of the problem too. It's that during the earliest decades of Islamic history, this was an oral culture, and there was even a kind of a worry that we should not write things down because the Quran is written down, and we don't want to get other things, historical accounts and stuff, mixed up with the Quran. So those things are orally transmitted, and writing is reserved for the Quran. And so we have these oral traditions that purport to, like by the time we get the sources that are written down in the ninth century, some of them say, like, they have games of telephone in them, right? They say, so and so told so and so, told so and so, told so and so, told so and so that Muhammad said this. And so there's people who spend their whole careers untangling those games of telephone and those so and so's and so and so's, and then just arguing about the different nature of an oral culture, which the Arabic Islamic culture was for the first 50 years. How does a historian, I mean, this is a problem that comes up with other oral histories, other oral cultures. How does the historian just like
Right.
reconstruct or have access to those
Right.
oral periods in history?
So here's another good one, because I really like this question because it's a genuine mystery. Who were the Sabians who are mentioned in the Quran as one of the peoples of the book? You've got the Christians, the Jews, and the Sabians, and nobody's ever really known for sure who the Sabians are, which is funny. I
Yeah.
mean, I tend to like when I learned of the existence of the Mandeans, like that made a lot of sense for me. And the Mandeans, for people who don't know, are like a sort of a Gnostic-ish uh, faith that is very few practitioners anymore, mostly in Iraq. John the Baptist, I think, is the central figure in their religion. And there seems to be a lot of overlap, like between what little we know of the Sabians and the Mandeans. But I don't know. You should take this one again because it's a very Quranic reference.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know that I'm going to be any help in telling you who the Sabaeans are. I think the only um, insight I have is Sean Anthony wrote a book a long, long time ago now on um, this kind of Sabaean heretic rabble rouser guy in early Islamic history, where he kind of surmised some things about what Sabaeanness was. But the only other thing I can think of is that there was a philosopher in early Islamic history who was said to have been a Sabaean of Haran, which I believe Haran is also in either Iraq or Eastern Syria, and that they were said to be star worshippers or star kind of astronomical people. But that never made sense to me. People saying that these star worshippers of Haran were the Sabaeans, because star worship to me seems to be polytheistic
Yeah, that seems
based.
outside the
And
boundaries of who would get to be a person of the book.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But that's one of the things that people would say is these kind of star worshippers. Maybe they were Neoplatonic star worshippers or something. But no, I'm afraid I can't. I don't know what these
I mean,
things
there's
are.
also
It's
the
a big mystery.
possibility, right, that they were the Hanifs, right, of Arabia, who were these just like we don't really know much about them either, do we? Like just like kind of Abrahamic monotheists who weren't Jews or Christians and were part of the mix again, like the pre-Islamic religious mix that from which Muhammad emerged and the Quran emerged. But I don't know. Again, like guessing.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I'm just looking up a name real quick. Someone who has done some work, a lot of work on the pre-Islamic Arabian kind of religion is Ahmed al-Jallad, who does all these, it's amazing work on these pre-Islamic inscriptions in Arabia in all kinds of different scripts, Safavidic script and these other scripts I couldn't tell you. But he and other scholars have shown essentially that about a century before Islam emerged, there was a some kind of proliferation in rock carvings and inscriptions of a reference to Allah as the God. And so there seems to have, like, we have some archaeological evidence that there was some kind of monotheism that it's hard to say much about it other than that it believed in this God, Allah, um, one God as opposed to Hubal and all these other a lot and these other goddesses and gods. That we find those inscriptions from about a century before the rise of Islam. So there's something going on with like
Yeah.
monotheisms happening in Arabia, but it's really hard to then say what label Sabians goes with, Hanifs goes with,
And it's, I mean, it's hard because there are people
non-denominational
of the book, so
monotheistic.
there's a text. There's got to be a text involved somewhere, but we don't have it. If there is one, yeah.
Right, right. Yeah.
Um, here's another one that we may not want to touch with a 10-foot pole, but as far as the historicity of events in the early caliphate goes, specifically the divergences between what would become Shia and Sunni sources, is there any way to determine which is more accurate? And I'm going to say no, there is not. But this does put me in mind of there's a older, he's not with us anymore, a German professor named Wilfred Madelung, who studied this very issue, and had a long career kind of writing about Shia historiography and Shia Islam, and eventually in the 90s wrote a book called The Succession to Muhammad, where he kind of dropped any pretense of being a scholar and was just like, the Shia were right, like the Shia were right. Let's just be clear about this. And it's funny because it gets held up in grad school as like an example of what not to do. Like, don't let yourself turn into this. But it is, it is interesting that he kind of eventually just decided to take a side. Like, it was always funny to me that he wound up there.
I know. Well, yeah, and it's such an interesting book. He also essentially blames this one early Umayyad guy, Marwan ibn al-Hakam, for like all the bad. He's like, Uthman wasn't such a bad guy, but Marwan,
Mhm.
this guy, like he has whole chapters on like Marwan is this guy, he's so bad. He's deceitful. He's doing all the um so yeah, he was really laying his cards out on the table there.
I think,
I
to be
don't
fair,
think
I
there's a
think when
way.
I was blogging about, like, regurgitating everything I remembered from grad school, way back when, I think I described Marwan as the first like really villainous character in Islamic history.
Oh
He's a
yeah.
sketchy guy. I mean, he's a really sketchy guy.
He's super sketchy. I mean, my favorite story about him is, well, okay, I won't get that sidetracked, but essentially, he might be the one who was really to blame for getting Uthman murdered. But that's neither here nor there. So to the question, I think the academic historian's answer has to be no. That doesn't mean that if you're a believing Muslim, you have to accept that. But for the academic historian, it's really hard to say which is accurate, but instead, I find it as an academic historian very valuable just to note that from the beginning, there are these divergent traditions, and that being comfortable with open questions, being comfortable with complexity, being comfortable with we can't always know with 100% certainty, but isn't it interesting to see the ways these two groups interacted with each other or
Right.
developed divergent narratives. So it's the development of the narrative itself that I think you have to kind of focus on rather than which one was historically right or wrong. I think people who aren't academic historians might be surprised, maybe disappointed, maybe disillusioned to learn the amount to which academic historians don't think we can know, the extent to which academic historians don't think we can know a lot of stuff about the past. We can ask questions about it, we can try to investigate those questions, but I think which is more authentic, it, I
Right.
don't know.
Right.
We're not equipped at this point to say. Yeah.
So I'm going to say one more, and then we can cut it off. But we did just get one in here. So this question is: the Abbasid dynastic transition is generally called a revolution. Why is that? There's a Shia Sunni aspect, which is sort of true-ish. But what makes it so distinct from like the Ming replacing the Mongols? And the first thing I would say is that the Ming did replace the Mongols in a revolution. The Red Turban Rebellions overthrew the Yuan dynasty in the 1350s, 1360s, and the Ming emerged as a replacement. So that was a revolution. But yeah, I mean, in the Abbasid case, it's a war. I mean, it's another civil war that does the Umayyads in, the fourth, I think, technically.
Yeah, but this is a big kind of political theory question, right? Is why do we call this a revolution as opposed to just a dynastic change? What makes a
Right.
revolution? Does it have to involve sweeping social change, sweeping cultural change? Does it have to be a grassroots movement? So you could enter into a long a line of scholarly debates about, is this really a revolution? But the reason I think it's viewed as a revolution and not merely as a dynastic change, by at least some people, has to do with a couple things. One is, yeah, the she stuff is part of the story there. You see me kind of
The Abbasids were
not
very
knowing exactly what
crafty.
to
The
say.
early Abbasids were very crafty about this, right? Like they didn't articulate
The
who was in charge. They didn't articulate an ideology. It was just sort of like, if you have a grievance with the Umayyads, we're your guys. And anybody who wants to project their grievances on us can imagine that the secret forces behind our uprising are on their side.
That's right. And so it seems like the Abbasid propaganda machine, and they had this underground network of people kind of spreading the word that, hey, if you support this person who they called Arida min al Muhammad, which means the chosen one, or like the satisfactory one from the family of Muhammad. And anyone who hears that is like, yeah, I want the satisfactory one
Cool.
to
Yeah,
be in
sounds
charge.
good.
Sure,
Right.
I'm on board with that. And so they got all these thousands and thousands of people to on board with this revolution in the name of this Rida, the chosen one, or the satisfactory one. And then finally, after they had kind of won this revolution, the Abbasid family comes out and they goes, like coming out of a
It's
cake, right?
us.
Like, surprise,
Hey,
it was
hi.
us. It was us. And so some people are like, okay, I guess. And a lot of, oops, not my phone. A lot of other people are like,
This isn't what
who are
we signed up
you? Like,
for. Yeah, what?
this isn't what we signed up for. You're just an Arab aristocratic family, just like the Umayyads were. And like, um, what's going on here? And so, and this was also, this slogan of Aridam and Al Muhammad is. All right, I'm keeping making my computer make a funny sound. My first live stream ever, y'all. So I'm a
Yeah,
bit of an
and
amateur
this is
here.
like my fifth, so bear with us, please. We apologize.
Um,
We're
but
noobs.
yeah, so the Shi'iness of the Abbasid revolution is very vague, right? It's this kind of vague sloganeering, and then the actual Shia seem to have been felt very betrayed by the fact that the person who rose to power was not related
Right.
to Ali in any way, shape, or form, or even to Muhammad other than through his uncle. So it was kind of
Yeah,
a tough
distantly.
hole. But I think the reason that they also view it as a revolution is because even though non-Arab Muslims did not end up actually taking over the caliphate, it was just another Arab aristocratic dynasty, they do seem to have had more cultural clout under the Abbasids, a little bit
Right.
more of what we might call a cosmopolitan culture under the Abbasids, people translating works from Persian into Arabic. So that in that way, I think people think of the Abbasids as a bit more of a revolution rather than just a dynastic change because there was a cultural
Yeah, there's
shift.
sort of a
Whether the Abbasids
reorientation,
themselves
right?
actually,
Yeah,
there was a
like
reorientation. Whether
the
the Abbasids themselves did
this
that or whether that was
central,
just
like the
happening.
geographic center moves from Syria to Iraq, which had been a
Sure.
rivalry. I mean, like the Iraqi Arabs and the Syrian Arabs were at each other's throats before, leading up to this. It's part of what fueled the revolution. But
Right.
you do have like you
For
do
sure.
have a more. Um, I mean, I hesitate to say it's like they adopted, you know, Persian court culture, but there is some of that. I mean, it does feel like it gets a little more regal in that sense. The power of the Arab tribes that had moved out into Iran and Khorasan, it grows quite a bit. They become the military backbone. So there's a lot of things that
That's right.
shift. It's not just the dynasty. It's not like, going from the Judeo-Claudians to the, whoever the next, I can't remember what the next dynasty was, in Rome.
Yeah.
It's not
Right.
it's not that simple. It's not just a shift of who's in charge at the top. There are really fundamental things that change between the
There
two.
are some cultural shifts.
Um,
Absolutely. And if nothing
Although I
else, the
do think
Abbasids
like
did a
people
better
refer to
job.
these as separate caliphates, which I always found to be problematic. Like it's not really a new caliphate. It is, there are a lot of
Right.
differences, but it creates the sense that like there's one discrete Umayyad caliphate that ends, and then there's another discrete caliphate that emerges, and that's not really what happens. That's overstated.
I believe that is certainly true. When I took these classes at the University of Chicago with Fred Donner, he taught a class called kind of like the origins of Islam or early Islam, and then he taught a course called the High Caliphates and the High Caliphate, and that was from the middle of the Umayyads once they had kind of established their
Right.
imperial authority and kind of built the Dome of the Rock and were like, hey, we are the emperors now through the kind of breakdown of Abbasid hegemony. So it was like this period where there is an emperor who wields the symbols of emperorness. I think can be considered the same institution of the caliphate, but there's a cultural and kind of underlying. I won't say like a whole cultural change, but maybe more. There's more broad-based and cosmopolitan participation in courtly politics
Yeah.
after the
Yeah.
Abbasids.
Yeah, really, I mean, Abdul Malik seems like the point where, I mean, once they start printing their own money that has Arabic phrases on it, it's not just a copy of the the Byzantine coins. Like that really seems like an
Right.
important statement about, this is an empire now and we're here to stay, and you
100%.
can start
Yeah,
there. Yeah.
100%.
Well, I think we've gone for almost an hour, and that was longer than I was even intending to keep you. So thank you, Elizabeth, for doing that and for jumping on with us. I hope people got some enjoyment out of this, or something from it.
Yeah.
And yeah, tell people where to go to find your. You've got two Substacks, so tell them where to go.
Yeah, I have two Substacks. So the one that will probably be of most interest to the people here is called Islamic History for the Curious on Substack. My other one is called Constellations of Resistance. It's a totally different, more political Substack where I basically interview people from my home state of Texas who are liberal leaning, left leaning, progressive leaning, or are otherwise just not happy with the way things are right now to kind of highlight the small everyday forms of resistance that people have even in the reddest of red states. Constellations of Resistance, Islamic History for the Curious. I post every week or every other week, depending on how with it I am. So thank you so much, Derek,
Nice.
for having me, and I really enjoyed this talk.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
thanks for joining in.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Do I hang up now?
I think I'm gonna hang up, so we'll
Oh,
we'll be good.